Scotland is not quite the country history taught you to imagine. The Picts did not simply disappear. Vikings did not only raid its shores. Clans were not one enormous biological family. Hadrian's Wall was never the border between England and Scotland, and some traditions now treated as ancient symbols of Scottish identity became standard centuries later than most people imagine. But go back far enough and something even stranger happens. Scotland disappears entirely. The mountains are there, the islands are there, and people are there, but there are no Scots, no clans, no Tartans, and no Scottish surnames. So we are counting down 30 facts, but strip away the familiar version of Scotland one layer at a time. And by number 1, the question will no longer be, who were the original Scots? It will be whether such a people ever existed in the first place. Fact 30. There was once a Scotland with no Scottish people. That sounds impossible, because modern maps make countries feel permanent. But thousands of years before kingdoms, flags or national identities, the landscape north of what we now call England was occupied by small communities who could never have called themselves Scottish. Their worlds were local, shaped by family, hunting territory, seasonal roots, neighbouring communities and survival. There was no Edinburgh capital, no Highland-Lowland divide, and no border separating Scottish identity from English identity, because neither national identity existed. The land is ancient, Scotland, as an identity, is not. Fact 29. After the last ice age, some of the earliest settlers of what is now Scotland lived lives shaped by coastlines, rivers and changing seasons. Imagine a family beside a cold western shore, gathering shellfish, fishing, hunting deer, and returning to familiar places throughout the year. Mesolithic communities left behind tools, food remains and traces of camps, showing that people were already making this landscape home thousands of years before written history. There were no castles, clans, kings or surnames. If one of these people somehow stood beside a modern Scot today, the modern person might call them an ancient Scottish ancestor. But the ancient person would have had absolutely no idea what Scottish meant. Fact 28. Then something happened that makes the idea of an untouched ancient Scottish population even harder to defend. Farming arrived. Agriculture did not simply appear because every local hunter-gatherer suddenly decided to grow crops. During the Neolithic, farming, domesticated animals, new technologies and monument building spread into Britain as part of a much wider European transformation involving movement of people as well as ideas. So thousands of years before Romans invaded, before anyone was called Pictish and before Viking ships reached Scottish shores, migration was already changing the population. The surprising part is not that Scotland later experienced migration. It is that migration belongs near the beginning of Scotland's human story. Fact 27. And prehistoric Scotland was not some forgotten edge of civilization. Look at Orkney. At Skara Brae, stone houses preserved beneath sand still contain beds, hearths and built-in furniture. Nearby, the stones of Stenness and Ring of Brodgar form part of an extraordinary monumental landscape. Picture a winter evening 5,000 years ago. Atlantic wind tears across the island while a family gathers around a hearth inside a stone house. Smoke rises, food is prepared, and outside enormous monuments stand against the horizon. These were sophisticated communities organizing labor, maintaining settlements, and participating in networks of ideas and exchange. Long before Edinburgh mattered, long before Stirling Castle existed, and long before Scotland had a king, communities in Scotland's far north were creating one of prehistoric Britain's most remarkable cultural landscapes. So perhaps Scotland's remote edge was not always an edge at all. And if this is already overturning the Scotland you thought you knew, subscribe to UK Bloodlines, because the closer we get to the Picts, Vikings and clans, the stranger the Ancestry story becomes. Fact 26. Ancient DNA makes that prehistoric story even more complicated. Genetic research across prehistoric Britain shows repeated episodes of migration, population change, and continuity. Populations did not remain biologically frozen for thousands of years. New groups arrived, earlier lineages continued in different proportions, and communities mixed. That means searching for one perfectly preserved population that can be labelled the original Scots immediately creates a problem. There were major population changes before Scotland existed, and written history is about to introduce a people whose name is often treated as though they were Scotland's mysterious original inhabitants. The Picts. Fact 25. The Picts were not a mysterious race that suddenly appeared from nowhere. Pict was a historical label applied to groups living across parts of northern and eastern Britain during late antiquity and the early medieval period. Roman writers helped popularize the name, but the communities behind it had deeper local roots. They farmed, fought and developed political centers and kingdoms. Their elites commissioned extraordinary carved stones whose symbols still provoke debate. Imagine a craftsperson cutting a crescent or double disc symbol into stone. With than 1,000 years ago, we can see that mark today. But what we cannot confidently recover is exactly what it communicated to the people standing before it. The symbols remain mysterious, the people do not need to be. And that distinction destroys one of the most romantic myths about ancient Scotland. The Picts were not some lost race appearing suddenly from the mist. Fact 24. More importantly, they did not simply vanish back into it. This may be the biggest misconception about the Picts. Their name gradually disappeared from political use as kingdoms changed, dynasties interacted and Alba emerged. Gaelic language and political culture became increasingly influential. But political identity disappearing is not the same thing as an entire population disappearing. Farms did not empty because chroniclers changed terminology. Families did not evaporate when rulers changed. People living in former Pictish territories continued marrying, moving, having children and becoming part of later Scotland. So where did the Picts go? In one important sense, nowhere. Their separate political identity disappeared far more completely than their descendants could have disappeared from the population. Fact 23. Rome also failed to do something people often assume was inevitable: permanently conquer all of what is now Scotland. Roman armies campaigned deep into the north, built forts and roads, and at different moments attempted to control territory beyond Hadrian's Wall. The Antonine Wall, much farther north, shows how fluid Rome's frontier could be. And here is the perception-changing detail. Hadrian's Wall was never the ancient border between England and Scotland. Neither England nor Scotland existed. Imagine Roman soldiers staring north from a frontier. They were not looking from England into Scotland. They were looking from Roman-controlled territory toward communities belonging to an entirely different political landscape. A modern border has been projected backward onto a world that would not have recognized it. Fact 22. After Roman power receded, the map became even less recognizable. There were Pictish kingdoms in the north and east, the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata in the west, Brittonic Strathclyde in the southwest, and Northumbrian influence extending into southeastern territory. These were not fragments of Scotland waiting patiently to be reunited. They were different political worlds. They competed, allied, intermarried, and fought. If you had travelled across what is now Scotland in this period, you could have crossed between communities speaking different languages and recognizing different rulers without ever leaving the borders of modern Scotland. The nation was still centuries away from looking inevitable. Fact 21. Early Gaelic Scotland makes our modern map even more misleading. Western Scotland and Northern Ireland were deeply connected through language, kinship, movement and political relationships across the Irish Sea. Today, water appears to separate two countries. Historically, that same water could connect communities. For some people living around the Irish Sea, crossing the water may have made more cultural sense than travelling across difficult territory inland. So the modern border tells you where Scotland ends today. It does not necessarily tell you where your ancestors' world ended. Fact 20. Then came the Vikings, but if you picture nothing except raiders, longships and burning monasteries, you are seeing only the opening scene. Norse settlers established farms, communities and political centres across parts of northern and western Scotland. They traded, cultivated land and formed families. Over generations, raiders could become settlers, settlers became neighbours, and neighbours became ancestors. In some places, Norse culture became extraordinarily powerful. Elsewhere it interacted with Gaelic communities and produced new combinations. So the Viking contribution to Scotland was not simply something done to Scotland. In some regions, Norse settlers eventually became part of the population that helped create Scotland. Fact 19. Nowhere is that clearer than Orkney in Shetland. Norse influence there became deeply embedded. Medieval political history, archaeology and place names preserve centuries of Scandinavian connection. Look across a map of the Northern Isles and Old Norse survives indirectly in names still spoken every day. Those names are linguistic fossils, but there is another layer. Modern genetic research has also demonstrated substantial Norse ancestry in Northern Isles populations. Although ancestry patterns vary, and genetics cannot be reduced to one simple Viking percentage, which means that for some families with deep roots in these islands, Viking history may not merely be the story of people who arrived nearby. It may be part of their family's population history. Fact 18. This is where the story turns directly towards your ancestry. Imagine 4 families living around the year 1100. One is in Shetland, one is in Argyll, one is near the borders, and one is in northeastern Scotland. Centuries later, their descendants could all describe themselves with exactly the same word, Scottish. But move backward, and their ancestral worlds separate. The Shetland family may belong to a heavily Norse-influenced society. The Argyll family may live in a strongly Gaelic world. The Borders family may sit within different Brittonic and Anglo-Scottish historical networks. The Northeastern family could inhabit territory whose population included descendants of communities once labelled Pictish. If your own documented ancestry reaches deeply into one of these regions, your DNA may preserve traces of some of those older population histories. But DNA cannot simply stamp Pict, Gael, or Viking onto your forehead. Genetic ancestry works through populations, mixture and probabilities, not romantic labels. And that is the real twist. Two people can both have deep Scottish ancestry while carrying very different histories behind the word Scottish. Fact 17. This changes the question completely. Scotland was shaped by Picts, Gaels, Britons, Norse settlers and other populations, rather than one founding tribe. Later medieval movements added further layers. So when someone asks, which ancient people were the Scots, the question contains an assumption that history does not support. It assumes one population was waiting in the past to become Scotland. But Scotland was produced by convergence. Different peoples did not simply occupy Scotland. Their descendants eventually helped become the Scots. Fact 16. The Kingdom of Scotland developed gradually. The name Alba became increasingly important as political power consolidated, particularly from the 9th and 10th centuries onward. Kenneth MacAlpin is traditionally associated with a crucial stage in the relationship between Pictish and Gaelic kingship. But Scotland was not created by one king pressing an imaginary national switch. Territory expanded, rival elites competed, royal authority changed, languages shifted, and political identities were absorbed and reinvented. There was no single morning when everyone woke up Scottish. Scotland emerged generation by generation. And here is the midpoint surprise. By the time a recognizable Scottish kingdom was developing, many things people now instinctively associate with Scottishness, including hereditary clan surnames, modern kilts and fixed clan tartans, still did not exist in their familiar forms. We have discovered who helped create Scotland. Now we need to discover who created the Scotland people think they remember. Fact 15. Start with surnames. Scottish surnames are generally much younger than Scottish ancestry. Your family line may stretch thousands of years into the past, while the surname attached to it became hereditary only during medieval or later centuries. Before fixed surnames, people might be identified by parentage, location, occupation, or personal characteristics. So imagine tracing your Scottish surname successfully back 700 years. You reached the first known bearer and think you have reached the beginning. You have not. You have reached the beginning of the label. The people behind it may have lived in Scotland for centuries before anyone in that family used the name you carry today. Fact 14. Even Mac, perhaps the most recognizable feature of Scottish surnames, tells less than people often imagine. Mac means son in Gaelic and historically could indicate descent, but names changed, branched, became hereditary at different times, and could become associated with wider social groups. A Mac surname can be an important genealogical clue, but it cannot tell your entire ancestral story. Your surname might be medieval, parts of your ancestry could be prehistoric. Confusing those to timelines is one of the easiest mistakes to make in genealogy. Fact 13. Clans create an even bigger surprise. A Scottish clan was not necessarily one enormous biological family descended from one medieval patriarch. Clans could contain close relatives, distant kin, followers, tenants, dependents and families connected through territory, protection or allegiance. Imagine a Highland chief, surrounded by hundreds of people associated with his clan. Some share close ancestry with him. Others belong because their families live on clan territory. Others are bound through service, loyalty or protection. Today, one surname looks like one family tree. Historically, one clan could represent an entire social world. So sharing a clan name with someone does not automatically mean the two of you descend from one man. Fact 12. Modern DNA can actually expose that complexity. Surname and clan DNA projects sometimes identify groups of men sharing paternal ancestry, while also revealing multiple unrelated paternal lines carrying the same surname. That should not be surprising once we understand how clans worked. Some branches may descend from common ancestors. Others may have acquired names through association, migration, or different historical processes. DNA does not destroy clan history. It often reveals how much more complicated clan history really was. Your surname is evidence. It is not a genetic verdict. Fact 11. Scotland itself was also culturally divided in ways modern imagery can hide. Highland and Lowland societies could differ significantly in language, economy, politics, and social organisation. Gaelic remained powerful across many Highland and Island regions, while Scots, and later English, dominated much of the lowlands. Neither was more authentically Scottish, both belonged to Scotland. But this matters because many traditions eventually marketed around the world as universally Scottish drew particularly heavily from Highland culture. If your family carries a Scottish surname or clan name, put it in the comments. Let's see which names appear most often in the UK Bloodlines community. Fact 10. Now picture a medieval Highland warrior. What is he wearing? If your imagination immediately gives him the neat modern kilt seen at weddings and Highland games, history has already played a trick on you. Highland clothing evolved. Earlier dress eventually included the belted plaid, a large piece of woolen cloth wrapped and gathered around the body, different from the tailored small kilt familiar today. The smaller kilt developed later as clothing practices changed, and the claim that one Englishman simply invented the kilt is itself too simplistic. Here is the real mind flip. The kilt is genuinely Scottish, but the globally recognizable version of it is not an unchanged costume passed down from ancient Celtic warriors. The tradition is real. Its supposed timelessness is the myth. Fact 9. Tartan creates an even stronger illusion. Patterned woven cloth has a long history in Scotland, but imagine travelling into the Highlands several centuries ago and asking every Campbell, MacDonald, or Fraser to show you the one officially recognised pattern belonging exclusively to their clan. You would be imposing a later system onto an earlier world. Fixed clan tartans became much more standardised in later centuries through military use, commercial weaving, romantic enthusiasm, and 19th century classification. That does not make clan tartans fake. It reveals something more interesting. Some traditions feel ancient not because they have remained unchanged for thousands of years, but because later generations gave them extraordinary emotional power. Fact 8. The Jacobite conflicts have been simplified in much the same way. They were not simply Scotland fighting England. Jacobitism centred on restoring the Stuart dynasty and involved monarchy, religion, political loyalty, and competing visions of the British state. Scots supported the Jacobites. Scots also fought against them. Some Highland clans joined the risings, others opposed them or remained cautious. So the famous image of Scotland rising as one nation against England makes for a powerful story. It just is not the history that actually happened. Fact 7. Culloden in 1746 became the emotional symbol of that story. On bleak ground near Inverness, the Jacobite army faced government forces in the final major battle of the Rising. Imagine the minutes before the fighting. Some Scottish families had fathers, sons and brothers among the Jacobites. Other Scottish families had relatives serving the government. Then the battle began. The Jacobites were decisively defeated, and the aftermath brought severe repression and major pressure upon structures associated with Highland resistance. But Culloden was not the day England conquered Scotland. Scotland had already been part of Great Britain for decades. Scots fought Scots at Culloden. The real history is more uncomfortable than the legend and more tragic because of it. Fact 6. Then Scotland's family history exploded beyond Scotland. Economic transformation, estate reorganisation, population pressure, the Highland clearances, and wider migration contributed to major movements of people during the 18th and 19th centuries. Experiences varied. Some emigrants pursued opportunity. Others left under enormous economic pressure. Some communities experienced eviction and displacement. Picture a Scottish family standing beside a few possessions as a ship prepares to sail. Behind them are mountains their ancestors may have known for generations. Ahead are Canada, the United States, Australia, or New Zealand. Their children grow up somewhere else. Their grandchildren speak differently. A century later, their descendants may know Scotland only through a surname, an old photograph, and a family story. And one of those descendants could be you. Fact 5. Millions of people outside Scotland carry Scottish family connections because those migrations created a global diaspora. Suppose you begin in Canada with a 19th century ancestor named MacDonald. A passenger record takes you across the Atlantic, a parish record leads into the Highlands. Eventually you identify the community where the family lived. You think, I found my clan, but you have actually opened a much larger door. What was happening in that region before the surname MacDonald became hereditary? What language did earlier inhabitants speak? Which kingdom controlled the area? Which migrations crossed it? Your surname may take you back centuries. The land beneath that surname can take you back thousands of years. That is where genealogy becomes something much bigger than a family tree. Fact 4. And if you keep travelling backward, the idea of one Scottish bloodline collapses. That hypothetical Highland family will lead into Gaelic cultural history, but populations existed there before Gaelic dominance. A Shetland family may lead much more strongly toward the Norse world. A Borders family may reveal another mixture entirely. Scotland's population was shaped by prehistoric settlers, Neolithic farmers, later prehistoric migrations, communities known as Picts, Gaels, Britons, Norse settlers, medieval movement and later migration from elsewhere in Britain and Europe. The people can therefore possess centuries of documented Scottish ancestry and still have remarkably different deeper population histories. Scottish ancestry is not one ancient ingredient. It is the name we give to thousands of different family journeys that eventually entered the same national story. Fact 3. Ancient DNA has made Scotland's origins more complicated, not simpler. There is no scientific test that can uncover one original Scottish genome and measure everyone against it. Genetic research instead reveals layers of migration, continuity and mixture. And DNA has limits. It may help researchers identify relationships between populations, but it cannot tell us whether an ancient person thought of himself as Pictish, which language he preferred, which ruler he supported, or whether his descendants centuries later considered themselves Gaelic. So if a modern DNA test tells you that you have Scottish ancestry, that does not mean scientists have identified a single ancient Scottish tribe inside your genome. The reality is far more fascinating. Your DNA can preserve traces of population history, but nationality itself is not encoded in a gene. Fact 2, which leaves one final misconception. Scottish identity has never been only about ancestry. It has been shaped by language, landscape, community, politics, memory, migration, and family. A Gaelic-speaking islander, a lowland merchant family, an Orcadian community shaped by centuries of Norse history and descendants of Scottish emigrants in Nova Scotia, can all possess genuine connections to Scotland while arriving there through completely different historical journeys. That does not weaken Scottish identity. It explains how Scotland was possible. A nation does not require everyone to descend from one people. Fact 1. Scotland is not one ancient people. It is what happened when many histories became one. Start on a post-Ice Age coastline with Mesolithic families moving through a landscape without Scotland. Watch Neolithic farmers arrive as part of transformations stretching far beyond Britain. Watch extraordinary communities build in Orkney. Watch later prehistoric populations move and mix. Then the names begin changing: Picts, Gaels, Britons, Northumbrians and Norse settlers. Kingdoms expand, kingdoms disappear, languages spread and retreat. Political identities that once seemed permanent become memories, Alba emerges, medieval Scotland grows. Families move, merchants arrive, armies cross borders and communities intermarry. Highland and lowland cultures develop differently. Scots leave 4 other continents, while newcomers continue entering Scotland. Now compress those thousands of years into your own family tree. Some branches disappear beyond surviving records. Others cross regions, some change language. Some acquire surnames, some join clans, some cross oceans. Eventually, centuries later, a descendant looks backward and asks, which of these people were the real Scots? But that is the wrong question. None of them alone was Scotland. Scotland emerged when their histories became connected through landscapes, kingdoms, languages, conflicts, memories, and generations of families. And that is the real historical twist. The Picts were not secretly the one original Scottish people. Neither were the Gaels, neither were the ancient Britons. Neither were the Vikings. Scotland's greatest historical secret is not discovering which one of these peoples were the original Scots. It is discovering that there was never one simple beginning. Beneath every castle, clan name, Tartan and family story lies another Scotland, and beneath that one, another still. So if you have Scottish roots, perhaps the most interesting question is no longer simply, what clan am I? Ask where your family lived. Ask what language people in that region once spoke. Ask who lived there before your surname existed. Ask which kingdoms rose and disappeared around them. Ask how many migrations crossed that landscape before anyone wrote your family name into a surviving record. And if DNA becomes part of that search, use it as another piece of evidence rather than an answer to everything. DNA may reveal connections your surname never could, while historical records may reveal identities that genetics never can. A family tree takes you backward through names. History takes you beyond those names into the worlds that created them. Once you see Scotland that way, the past stops looking like one straight ancestral line. It becomes thousands of journeys crossing, separating and meeting again. That may be the real wonder of Scottish ancestry. Not that every Scot leads back to one ancient people, but that so many different human stories eventually became part of the same extraordinary inheritance. Scotland didn't inherit one history. It inherited thousands and turned them into one extraordinary story. If you want UK Bloodlines to investigate another hidden chapter of Scottish history next, tell me which one in the comments.